Hello, class, and welcome to this part of our lecture in Brain and Behavior, where we'll be focusing in this particular part of the lecture on the somatosensory system. Within this, we will be exploring how different researchers have explored and gained some insights into the somatosensory system. We'll then move on to exploring a little bit of the different kinds of sensory information the somatosensory system is designed to process and how it plays a crucial role in our everyday experiences. We'll then move on to explore the peripheral organization of the somatosensory system, because there are receptors and neural pathways that are responsible for transmitting sensory information from our body's periphery to the central nervous system for its final perception processing. So this will inevitably explore somatosensory transduction, which is basically where the physical stimuli we encounter in our environment are transformed into neural signals that our brain can interpret. We'll also look a little bit at the various diversity of receptors that we have in our bodies, each specializing in detecting specific sensory information. And of course, we will explore the intricate somatosensory pathways that move into our brain and through our brain, specifically through the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex within our parietal cortex. And of course, we'll explore a little bit of the role of the parietal cortex in integrating and interpreting sensory information. And in the midst of that will set us up well for the second part of our lecture that will explore a little bit more of the ideas of specific types of aphasia and of ataxia. Now, as we begin, as always, I'd like to highlight the work of people in a particular field. And today I'd like to highlight the work of Dr. Ramachandran from the psychology department at the University of California, San Diego. Now, Dr. Ramachandran, some people just call him Rama, is a very well-established neuroscientist and psychologist whose work has had a profound impact on our understanding of the brain's somatosensory functions. Ramachandran's work is well recognized, particularly in studies involving a phenomenon known as phantom limb syndrome, which is essentially a condition in which individuals who have lost a limb still perceive their sensations and sometimes even pain in the missing appendage. And his research on this phenomenon has provided some really crucial insights into the brain's ability to reorganize itself following injury, and has really opened the door to innovative treatments for individuals that suffer from phantom limb pain. There's also been some work that his laboratory has done in the area of synesthesia, which is a condition where sensory experiences become intertwined, and have shed light on the complex and interconnected nature of the brain's sensory systems. So overall, his laboratory's work has been somewhat interdisciplinary. It tries to combine elements of neurology and psychology and cognitive science. But overall, it's served us well in our exploration of the somatosensory system of the brain. So I'd like to just explore a little bit of the idea of how we the different types of somatic stimuli that encompass our somatosensory system, and the kinds of information that originate from the body surface as well as internal organs. And this stimuli really provides us with some essential information about our environment, as well as, of course, our understanding of our own physical state. So we can kind of think of somatic stimuli as being categorized into various types of stimuli. And we all know these intuitively. We have our tactile stimuli, touch. There's thermal, with temperature. Nociceptive, which would be pain. There's proprioceptive, which would be body position. And vestibular, which is our balance and sense of spatial orientation kinds of sensations. And each type of stimulus really serves a unique purpose in helping us to navigate the world around us. So just consider how somatic stimuli can impact your life, from the pleasure of a warm hug to the discomfort of a pinprick. These somatic sensations really influence our experience of existence, our emotions, our behaviors, as well as, of course, our decision making. So understanding these sensations really is pivotal in comprehending our embodiment experience and our body's responses to different stimuli, because the brain has this uncanny ability to process somatic stimuli, and that's really a fundamental aspect of sensory perception. So how we perceive the texture of an object, the temperature of the water we're swimming in, or the pain from an injury like twisting our ankle, and how that involves intricate neural processes, is something that I think is really important for us to be mindful of. So overall, somatic stimuli is of immense practical importance. Basically, if there are abnormalities in somatosensory processing, that can lead to conditions such as chronic pain disorders, or sensory deficits, or an altered perception of your body. And so being able to understand the systems that make up our somatic stimuli can go a long ways to helping us understand and help people that are suffering from these types of struggles within life. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of begin with exploring the peripheral organization of this system, because it's really critical in understanding how the somatosensory information moves from our body to our central nervous system, and therefore understanding how the system itself works. And so the first key aspect of the peripheral organization is the presence of these specialized sensory receptors located throughout our body. And these receptors are responsible for detecting various somatic stimuli, such as pressure, temperature, pain, and proprioception. And in my understanding of artificial intelligence, for example, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. This is part of the reason why I think that, and I have always thought that artificial intelligence as being a good human analogy cannot be reached in a large language model, because a lot of our human experience is tied up with our sensory receptors. So unless a computer has access to receptor sites and some kind of system for measuring pressure and temperature and pain and proprioception and having an embodied experience, they can never really grasp what it is and mimic what it means to be human, because we are so much of our embodied experience. Now, we've mentioned a little bit about sensory receptors and how they're specialized, and once somatic stimuli is detected by sensory receptors, they are converted into that electrochemical signals. And these signals are then transmitted through specific pathways to relay stations in the central nervous system. And understanding these pathways is essential for comprehending our sensory information and how it's conveyed to the brain. And so we need to kind of be mindful of the idea of the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, because this plays a crucial role in the transmission of somatic sensory information. And it consists of sensory neurons that carry signals from receptors to the central nervous system, as well as motor neurons that carry commands from the brain to and through the spinal cord to muscles and glands. So the peripheral nervous system acts as an intermediary between the external world and the brain. And then we have something called dermatomes. And dermatomes are specific regions of the skin that are innervated by particular spinal nerves. And they provide a map of how sensory information from different parts of the body is organized in the peripheral nervous system. And so understanding dermatomes aids in diagnosing and localizing sensory deficits or specific injuries. Now, it's also important for us to explore a little bit of somatosensory transduction. And somatosensory transduction is the fundamental process by which sensory receptors convert various physical stimuli, let's say, for example, pressure or pain, into electrical signals or action potentials. These signals are really kind of the language of the nervous system, allowing for the transmission of sensory information. So to initiate transduction, the sensory receptors located throughout our body are activated by specific types of stimuli. So for example, mechanical receptors in the skin respond to mechanical pressure, while thermoreceptors are sensitive to changes in temperature. And so these specialized receptors generate graded potentials when stimulated. And so the graded potentials generated by sensory receptors are then transformed into action potentials. And this is obviously a crucial step in transmitting information to the central nervous system. And so this conversion occurs through a series of complex biochemical and electrical processes. And the frequency and pattern of action potentials generated by the sensory receptors then carry the information about things like the intensity, the duration, and the quality of the sensory stimulus. And then the brain has the job of interpreting these patterns to create our conscious perception of touch and temperature and pain, or whatever somatic sensation is appropriate. And so the sensory receptors are very adaptive. And so their responsiveness will decrease over time in the presence of a constant stimulus. And so this adaptation helps filter out the unchanging sensory information and allows us to focus on very novel or important sensory inputs. That's why when you first sit down in the chair, you notice how comfortable it is, but then you forget about the chair. The same thing would be when you go into water, when you say you're swimming in a cold lake. You notice the coldness initially, but after a while, you don't really notice it. And that's part of that adaptive part of the systems. Now, as I mentioned, there are very specialized somatosensory receptors that are specialized in detecting specific types of sensory information. And I just want to kind of go over those again for us. So we have first off the mechanical receptors, are sensory receptors that respond to mechanical stimuli, such as pressure or vibration or touch. And these are found at various parts of our body, most commonly the skin, and as well as in the deep tissue to some extent. And the different types of mechanical receptors are tuned to detect different aspects of touch, from light stroking through to deep pressure. There's also thermoreceptors that are specialized in detecting changes in temperature. So these help us to discern whether something is hot or cold or at an intermediate comfortable temperature. And these receptors are really essential for maintaining our body's thermoregulation. Then we have nociceptors, and these are the ones that we don't like because these are the pain receptors, and so they're responsible for protecting us from potential harmful stimuli. Now, when activated, these nociceptors send signals to the brain, alerting us of potential threats or of injuries. And so pain perception is a very complex yet essential part of our existence. We then have things like proprioceptors, which are receptors that tell us the location of muscles and tendons and joints. And so these provide information about where our body is positioned, and that helps us to coordinate our movements and allows us to have a sense of our own embodied experience. It gives us bodily awareness and coordination. There's also something called the baroreceptors that are found in blood vessels and in the heart, and these are responsible for detecting the changes in blood pressure. And so they will play a vital role in doing things like regulating our blood pressure to maintain a healthy homeostasis within that. We also have chemoreceptors. Now, while these primarily associated with other sensory systems, chemoreceptors in the somatosensory system can detect chemical changes, such as the presence of certain molecules related to tissue damage or inflammation. And so these can go a long way to help contribute to, say, for example, our perception of pain. There's also vestibular receptors that are really kind of associated with balance and spatial orientation. So these vestibular receptors, primarily in the inner ear, are closely related to the somatosensory system as far as providing us information about head position and movement, as well as contributing to our overall sense of our body's awareness. And so I think it's just important for us to be aware that there are these different types of somatosensory receptors that are specialized to provide information to our central nervous system for interpretation. And so that this is another link in that chain of possible things that can go wrong within our bodies. Now, let's take a look at how this somatosensory information from the periphery moves to the central nervous system and ultimately to our brain's cortex and gives us that subjective perception of touch and temperature and pain. So this really kind of begins with the primary afferent neurons, and we call these sensory neurons. And these neurons have specialized endings in the skin or the other tissue that detect the somatic stimuli. When activated by the stimuli, they generate the electrical signals, what we call the action potentials. And these action potentials from these primary afferent neurons travel along nerve fibers to a structure called the dorsal root ganglion, which is located just outside the spinal cord. And here, sensory information remains in that electrochemical signal. And then the sensory information enters the spinal cord, where it goes through what we call the spinal cord processing. So it goes through an initial processing and integration. So there are some reflex responses to somatic stimuli that can be generated at levels without involving the brain's cortex. And so this would be an example of someone that has a upper spinal cord injury where they are quadriplegic, can't move or feel their arms or legs, and yet if you put them on a bicycle, like a stationary bike and strap them in and start them pedaling, their muscles can actually pedal because it's part of a reflex response that's going on in that kind of initial processing. So it's while the connection between the spinal cord and the brain is severed, the spinal cord can process a limited amount of somatosensory information on its own. And now, most somatosensory information, though, ascends through specific ascending pathways in the spinal cord and will reach the brain. And these pathways include the spinothalamic tract and the dorsal column medial pathway. And the ascending pathways ultimately lead to the thalamus, which, as we've mentioned a little bit already, is a key relay station. That you can kind of think of the thalamus as a gatekeeper where it filters and redirects sensory information to the appropriate areas of the cortex for its further processing. So from the thalamus, the somatosensory information is further relayed to specific regions of the cortex, primarily the primary somatosensory cortex, we call this the S1, and the secondary somatosensory cortex, we call this the S2. And these areas are responsible for processing things like the location and intensity and quality of the somatic sensations. Now, within the primary somatosensory cortex, there is a precise organization known as somatotopy. You can think of topography as the texture and quality of land. Somatotopy is the texture and quality of information in the cortex. And so this means that specific regions of the cortex correspond to specific parts of the body. For instance, the area representing the finger is adjacent to the area representing the hand. And in the cortex, this somatosensory information is integrated with other sensory inputs in other parts of our cortex, such as the visual and auditory information, as well as higher level cognitive processes in our frontal lobe. And this integration allows us to have that holistic perception of our environment and ourselves. But that's the whole cortex. The somatosensory information is really processed primarily by that parietal cortex that we've talked about. Now, I mentioned a little bit about somatotopy, and so I want to kind of delve into that just a little bit more, because the parietal cortex is the portion of the brain responsible for making sense out of our tactile experiences and spatial awareness. So the parietal lobe, if you recall, is located near the top and back of the brain, and it is divided into those two main regions, the primary somatosensory cortex and the secondary somatosensory cortex. And these areas are situated in the parietal lobe, which is kind of that hub for integrating sensory information. So the S1, the primary somatosensory cortex, is the first stop for somatosensory information that comes from the thalamus. And its primary responsibility is processing the basic sensory attributes, such as where does the information come from, what's its location, what's its intensity, of the tactile information. And so the primary somatosensory cortex has very precise somatotopic organization. That is, that where different parts of the body are represented in distinct areas of the cortex. And then we have the secondary somatosensory cortex, which lies adjacent to the primary somatosensory cortex and is responsible for more complex processing of somatosensory information. And this helps to interpret the quality and context of the tactile information. So the secondary somatosensory cortex really is critical for things like recognizing objects by touch and understanding the emotional aspects of touch. Now, overall, the parietal lobe, particularly in the right hemisphere of the parietal lobe, plays a vital role in our spatial awareness, and it helps us construct a mental map of our body and its relation to the external world. And so damage to this region can lead to things like spatial neglect, which is a condition where individuals have difficulty perceiving one side of their body or of perceiving their surroundings. And you need to kind of be mindful that the parietal lobe is also involved in multisensory integration. So it combines somatosensory information with input from other sensory modalities, such as vision and proprioception, to create a coherent perception of the environment. Now, in addition to sensory processing, the parietal cortex is involved in sensory motor integration. So it helps our body's movement in response to somatosensory information. So this function is crucial for tasks that require hand-eye coordination, such as grasping objects. And beyond sensory and motor functions, the parietal cortex is involved in higher cognitive processes like attention and memory and decision-making, and it helps us allocate attention to relevant sensory stimuli and make sense of the information that we receive. So understanding the parietal cortex and somatosensory processing really is, I think, essential for appreciating how our brain constructs our tactile experiences and spatial perception. And one concept that I think is very important is the concept of the somatosensory homunculus, which is a visualization of how the brain represents different parts, different body parts within the primary somatosensory cortex. It's a distorted humanoid figure where certain body parts are disproportionately large or small relative to their actual size. And this distortion reflects the density of sensory receptors that the level of cortical representation dedicated to processing sensory information from each body part. Now, some key aspects to be mindful of the somatosensory homunculus, which basically just means little man. In the homunculus, body parts have a high density of sensory receptors and really require fine motor control, such as with the hands and lips, and those are depicted as larger. Now, in contrast, body parts with fewer sensory receptors, like the back or legs, are represented as much smaller. And the somatosensory homunculus really kind of illustrates the functional representation of body parts of the brain, and it highlights that different parts of the primary somatosensory cortex are specialized for processing sensory information from specific regions of the body, and this gives us a sense of our actual embodied experience. Now, something to be mindful of here. The somatosensory homunculus isn't necessarily fixed. It can be changed over time due to neuroplasticity. So, for example, if someone frequently uses their fingers in a highly skilled manner, then the representation of their fingers in the primary somatosensory cortex may become more pronounced. So that's something to be mindful of, that there is a little bit of tweaking that can go on in the somatosensory homunculus. Now, I'd like to kind of just dive into some interesting studies having to do with somatosensory perception. One fascinating area of research that has significantly contributed to our understanding of the parietal cortex's role in somatosensory perception is a fun little illusion called the rubber hand illusion. And this illusion, which is a product of experimental psychology, highlights the brain's remarkable ability to integrate sensory information from multiple sources and adapt to new sensory input. Now, in the classic rubber hand illusion experiment, a participant places their real hand out of sight and replaces it with a realistic looking rubber hand that is positioned in front of them. The participant's real hand and the rubber hand are simultaneously stroked or tapped with a brush, and this creates the illusion that the rubber hand is their own hand. And as a result of this synchronous sensory input, participants often report feeling a sense of ownership over the hand. And they may even experience a strange sensation as if the body has shifted to incorporate the rubber hand into their body's schema. And the rubber hand illusion really provides a compelling demonstration of the parietal cortex's role in somatosensory perception. And here's how it relates to our understanding of the parietal cortex. The illusion really illustrates the brain's ability to integrate sensory information from the different sources, including the visual and tactile and proprioceptive clues. And these clues converge in the parietal cortex, where the brain processes and interprets them. And the experiment really challenges our perception of body ownership and the boundaries of self. The sensation of the rubber hand is part of one's body demonstration that demonstrates that the parietal lobe's role in constructing and maintaining our body schema, that is the brain's internal representation of body's spatial and sensory inputs. Now, what ends up happening with rubber hand? Well, once there's been some association, then the rubber hand is like smashed with a hammer or something, and that causes a shock to the person's brain, because the brain registers it as they're trying to smash your own hand, when in fact it isn't, and you consciously know it isn't, but part of your brain thinks it is. Now, studies involved with patients with parietal cortex damage have shown altered experiences of this rubber hand illusion. So, for example, these individuals may not perceive the illusion as strongly, or may not experience a sense of ownership over the rubber hand. And so this underscores the importance of the parietal cortex in this process. And the rubber hand illusion also, I think, reveals the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity, which is the ability to reorganize and adapt. When the brain integrates the rubber hand into the body schema, it demonstrates the flexibility of somatosensory representations within the cortex. And I think that's just a fascinating part of our understanding our embodied experience. Now, as we close out this part of our lecture, I just want to kind of highlight a few things. First off, a few key terms. The somatosensory system. Remember, that's the system responsible for processing sensory information related to things like touch and temperature and pain and proprioception, and that allows us to perceive and interact with the world in our embodied experience. There are sensory receptors, and these are specialized structures in the body, such as mechanical receptors and thermoreceptors and nociceptors, that detect different types of somatic stimuli, like pressure or temperature or pain. As far as where in our brain this kind of information is processed, that is in the parietal cortex. So the brain region located in the parietal lobe is responsible for processing and integrating this somatosensory information, as well as contributing to spatial awareness and body perception. And we can think of the somatotopy, which is the organization of the primary somatosensory cortex that assigns specific areas to represent different parts of the brain. And this results in that somatosensory homunculus that is the picture of our embodied somatosensory experience. Now, overall, in this lecture, we've looked at peripheral organization, where the sensory receptors throughout the body detect the somatic stimuli and then send that off through the neural pathways to the central nervous system. We've looked at somatosensory transduction, how that physical stimuli is converted into the neural signals. We've looked at the different types of somatosensory receptor types, the somatosensory pathways, how it moves from the periphery through the spinal cord to the thalamus and then ultimately to the specific part of the cortex, specifically the parietal cortex, and how the parietal cortex has that role of sensory discrimination, spatial awareness, multisensory integration, as well as contributing to the higher cognitive functions. And we've also taken a look at the somatosensory homunculus, where we visualize that distorted body as being a representation of how the primary somatosensory cortex highlights different parts of our body. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you in the next part of our lecture. You take care. Bye-bye.